Welcome to Articulate English webinar, Close Reading and Contextual Readings. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I'm hosting and recording this webinar from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all are participating in this webinar, and we pay our respect to elders past and present. My name is Meg, and I work in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney. Just quick housekeeping, this webinar has live transcription. So to see live transcription, please go to the Zoom toolbar at the bottom. You can click the little arrow next to the live transcript, or it's at CC, and you can hit show subtitle or view full transcript, and you'll be able to see the live transcription there. This webinar will be recorded so that if for anyone who are unavailable to join us today can have a look at that later on. This webinar involves some interactive activities and you're encouraged to participate. And there will be a live Q&A session later on. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom Zoom toolbar on your screen. Before introducing Dr. Isabelle Hesse, I'd like to thank her for her time and contribution to support the high school community. And I'd also like to say thank you to Felicia Voyages, our current PhD student at the University of Sydney, researching in the field of children and young adult literature. Felicia has made great contribution to this webinar, developing resources and sharing her expertise with her teaching background for secondary high school English. So thank you, Dr. Hesse and Felicia, for your contribution. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Isabelle Hesse. Dr. Hesse is a senior lecturer in the Department of English at the University of Sydney. Dr. Hesse researches and teaches modern and contemporary world literatures. Her work focuses on postcolonial, Jewish, and Middle Eastern studies, and she has widely published in these areas and their intersections, including on the cultural and political connections between Europe and the Middle East. She's also interested in postcolonial writing and theory, Israeli and Palestinian literature and film, and the cultural memory of the Holocaust and colonialism in Europe. Please welcome Dr. Isabelle Hesse.
Thank you, Meg, for this very kind introduction. And also wanted to thank Felicia for all the work she has put into the seminar, researching materials and providing resources. Before I start today, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and culture. The University of Sydney's Camperdown campus, where my office is located and where I did the majority for this webinar, is on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future. And I'd also like to extend this acknowledgement to any First Nations people joining us on Zoom today. So what we're going to do today is discuss close and contextual reading. And I've given you a very broad overview of what we're going to do today. So in the first section, we're going to think about close reading. What are some of the key aspects of doing a close reading? And I'm also going to show you some examples. And this part is also going to include a short activity where I just asked to respond on Padlet to a few questions. It's really important to note that some of the skills we're talking about here are, of course, relevant for your HSC exams, and there's going to be specific advice about exam situations, but it's also more widely just to get a sense of how to do a close reading of a seen or unseen text. In the second part, we're then going to focus on contextual reading, so understanding and using context, and at the very end, there's going to be some time for questions. I'm also going to pause in between parts 1 and 2 if there's any questions coming through the Q&A function on Zoom, and then I'll respond to further questions at the end. So please feel free to put questions into the Q&A bit at any point as they arise. So part 1, close reading. The key aspects that I want to discuss in relation to close reading, and as you can already see, this is focused on an exam context as well, but any kind of assignment where you're asked to do a close reading, whether this is in high school or later at university, is divided into 3 parts. So the first thing we're going to think about is understanding the question. Then we're going to move on to thinking about different text types that you might encounter in a close reading situation. And finally, again, this is focused on writing specifically about close reading in an assignment context, is how to use evidence. So the evidence that you find in the close reading that you just carried out and how you construct that into a coherent answer. So the first part, and some of this might be obvious, but I thought it would be good to remind everyone of some of the key things that you should be doing when you tackle a question. So the first one is to underline keywords in the question. So what are the keywords that the question asks you to address? And then really make sure that you address them in your answer. So what is the main aspect of a question? What does it ask you to do? And how should you construct your answer as a result of this? So as I just said, it's really important to think about what the question asks you to do. And there's different types of questions, and I've listed a few here. And on the handout that we're going to share at the end of the session, there's also a more detailed explanation about each of these types of questions. But it's important to think about, does a question ask you how? So what techniques, what features is an author using to do a certain thing? Does it ask you to compare? So should you bring in another text? Should you compare two unseen texts? Or is this a question that is focused on a singular text? To what extent? So it's asking you to assess how effective something is, or to what extent you think that something is happening. And also evaluate. Again, this asks you for your own value judgment and to bring in your own perspective. And I've also included a link on the slides to the NASA's glossary of terms, which not only explains some of these question words, but also is a really useful overview of some other keywords that you might find in HSC exam and more widely in your assignments when you engage with literary texts, but also other, other texts such as visual texts. And here's an example of a question that came up in a 2020 HSC exam. So the question is, how do these texts use a variety of language forms and features to communicate ideas about being creative? So if you unpack this question, you might start with what the question is asking you to do. So the first word you would pick out is how. You then look a bit closer at the question and you can see that the question is already giving you a clue in terms of what aspect of how you should be focusing on, because it talks about language forms and features. So this is what you should be paying attention to, language forms and features and how these are used. But then the other important thing is to examine what should you relate language forms and features to, or what kind of language forms and features should you be looking for? And the answer in this case is being creative. So the key idea you're asked to focus on here is being creative and examining how the text that you've been asked to analyze use language forms and features to comment on being creative. Or maybe you can also think about how the forms and features themselves tell you something about being creative. So focusing both on content and on form to respond to this question. Then it's important, once you've unpacked what the question asks you to do, to think about the type of text that you're asked to engage with. So I'm using the example of an unseen text here, but of course, with a seen text, it's always good to bear in mind as well what kind of example of a text you're working with. And I've divided this into three very broad categories, where on one hand you have prose fiction, you have nonfiction, and then you have visual texts or illustrations. Of course, there's many different subcategories that you find in these different text types, but it's really important to start with this overarching category to get a sense of some of the key strategies that are usually used in this kind of text, and also to set a comparative context, so to think about what other texts have I seen that fall into this category. Once you've thought about the overarching category that you can put your text into, it's important to understand techniques. So I've listed a few here, and I'm sure you have discussed those in your lessons already, and you'll be discussing them in more detail throughout the year. But some of the really important things to focus on include language. So paying attention to the kind of language that the author uses, and this can be both visual language and textual language. Thinking about anything unusual that you notice. Is there any kind of word that they're using that is unexpected? Does their language use remind you of another text that you've seen, of anything else? Really thinking about how would you describe their language? For example, is it a very elaborate language? Is it simple language? Is it formal language or informal language? And then make a few notes about your ideas. Then it's important to think about imagery, metaphors, and symbolism. So the kind of ideas that are conjured up, the images that are conjured up to a certain text. And again, it's really important to just write down the ideas that come to mind, because this will help you later on to think about what other texts you might link this to, or what other contexts you could think about in relation to your chosen text or the text that has been given to you. Another important technique to pay attention to is the tone. So what kind of tone is the author using? Are they angry? Who are they addressing, which links to the next idea? So the audience, what can you say about the tone that they're using? How do you perceive their tone as a reader? Again, audience is quite an important aspect of understanding technique as well. So what kind of audience is the author writing for? Who are you as an audience reading this text? And then, of course, comparing the audience that they had in mind when they first published their text, and then the audience that is now reading this text in a contemporary period. And then for visual text, it's also important to think about colors and composition. What kind of colors do the visual texts use? How are they composed? Where do they situate certain elements? What do they draw our attention to the use of colors and composition? And I think in general, it's really important to focus on this last idea. So what does the author draw our attention to? What do they want us to notice? And what is maybe more subtly or implied to other techniques that they use? And it's not just important to consider these techniques in isolation, but also think about the links between them. For example, how does color link to imagery? How does the tone link to the idea of the audience? So it's just really important to think about these different categories on their own, but also how they relate to each other and how they work together to make a point about a certain text. So some questions that you might like to think about, and this is specifically about unseen text, but I think you can also apply some of them to a seen text. What type of text is your unseen text? Which kind of category would you put in this text into? Are there any kind of subcategories that you would use to describe this text? For example, you could say it's a non-fiction text and it's a journalistic article and it was published in a newspaper or an online newspaper or in a magazine. So already you get an indication of the audience and also who it's written for and what kind of style it might be using. Then you might like to think about what some typical features or techniques are usually part of a certain text. If you think about the journalistic text, you might like to think about that it's often written in accessible language. It's aimed at a general audience, so it often draws on current events and it brings in ideas that a lot of people can relate to. It's then really important to think about which techniques your specific unseen text uses and why. So once you've thought about a list of features that are typical for text, you can think about which ones does this specific text draw on and why. And it's really important here to not just use a list of literary techniques, but really explain how they're used by the author and link specific examples directly to the question. So if we return to the question that I showed you earlier, so how do these texts use language, forms, and features in order to tell us something about being creative? If you bring in a technique that shows that they're not creative at all, that might be interesting, but there's no point just listing by saying, oh, they're using an alliteration in line 3, and in line 5, we have a metaphor, but you don't really tell us what this achieves or how it links specifically to being creative. For example, you could say that they use alliteration in an interesting way if they do, and if they don't, there's no point discussing it because it doesn't add anything to your answer. The other thing that you might like to think about, and again, this depends on the module that you're writing your answer for and more widely on the question, what the text tells us about human experiences. And I think more generally, this is a good question to bear in mind. So really thinking about how texts appeal to something that might be relatable across different audiences and also across different countries and cultural contexts. And then finally, how do the texts that you know compare to the unseen text that you're encountering, and what is similar and what is different? And again, this is not something that might be specifically asked of you, and it depends on how much time you have, but it's also always really good to think about the text that you're seeing. How does it relate to other texts that you know? Because this really allows you to unpack some of the things it's doing, to compare what is novel and what might be the same in comparison with other texts. So if you do have time, and maybe in a situation that is not an exam, it's a really good idea to spend a bit of time thinking about other texts that you know and how your unseen text compares to this catalog of texts that you're working with. So I thought it would be good to do a short activity to get us thinking about these different questions and how we might tackle them in a specific situation where we have an example that people haven't seen before. So I'm just going to post a link in the chat to the Padlet, which we're going to use to do this activity, and I'm just going to briefly explain it. So it's a short activity, so it's around 5 minutes, so you probably won't have time to look at all the different questions. So the questions are the ones that I just discussed in detail, so the ones that it's good to think about in relation to an unseen text. So feel free to maybe pick one or two that you're most interested in and write a few ideas on Padlet if you want to, or just make a few notes to yourself. And the unseen text that I want you to focus on, and there's also a copy on the Padlet, is the image that you can see here. So just anything about this image that you think is interesting and worth drawing attention to. So as I said, we're going to take around 5 minutes. So I'll just give you until 10 to 5 to write down a few ideas. And if you can write them under the corresponding question, that would be great. And then I'm going to see what's on the Padlet. I might share some ideas. We're also going to go through each of these questions in relation to the image that I've put on the screen here. So take around 5 minutes and then we'll be back in the webinar. Okay, I can still see some answers coming through. I might just start with the first question and feel free to add more things as I go through your answers. So thank you very much for these really great responses. As you can see, lots of answers coming through. And I'm going to start with the first one. So what type of text is this unseen text? And it's really interesting because already you can see that people have different answers. We have visual imagery. You also have a visual text. Some people already talk about it being specifically collage made with rocks. Someone also mentioned sculpture, which I really like. So you're paying attention to the artwork that the image is taken of, which is really important. We also have an illustration with a physical mixed media of rocks. Again, really this emphasis on this is an image of an artwork. And then you also have image, illustration, and graphic. And someone mentions here as well, put together with clay-like structure. And I like this, and already you can see that you're thinking about what's coming up in the next sections. And then thinking about some of the typical features or techniques of this type of text, people mention ideas such as colors. So someone is saying the low-key tones add a sense of melancholy and sadness to the image. Fantastic, and that's already tapping into question number 3 as well. So this sense of like how are colors used and what is the effect of this? Someone mentions focal point, salience, composition, symbolism and metaphor, color, contrast, repetition, shape, line, and vectors. Fantastic. I think this is a really exhaustive list of some of the things you can draw on when constructing an answer in relation to this unseen text. Other people also mentioned the gaze. I think absolutely it's really interesting if you have an image of people and you think about where your gaze is drawn, but also where the people themselves might be looking. Again, we got some other ideas coming through. So this idea of signs and symbols, the composition, so the scale and the color. So what is bigger, what is smaller in the picture, where is our attention directed? And I'll just have a quick look. And then we're thinking about some of the techniques that this text specifically uses and why. So already we have this idea of symbolism, so color, size, and body stance, the ambiguity of the sun or the moon in the sky. Is it suggesting that the burden never ends? I think that's a really interesting reading, and I'm going to comment on that in a minute when I share a bigger picture of the image itself. Someone mentions that the symbolism of the rocks is used to represent people's issues, emotional baggage, absolutely, and struggles that everyone experiences in life. And already this also links to question 4, so thinking about the human experience. Someone mentions that the color gray is associated with sadness, and the dull colors represent unhappiness. Absolutely. So you can think about the mode or the tone or the atmosphere that is set up through the colors and how this contributes to our overall understanding of this text. And someone mentions that there's symbolism because of the proportion of the people and the items that they carry. And I think, and they say that they are carrying in order to provide a sense of insanity caused by oppression. I think it's very interesting to draw attention to the size of the different elements in this picture, and where we can see the size of the burden that they carry compared to their body size. Absolutely. Then we have the brighter colored stones against the dark background, which is an important thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. The symbolism of the rock as representing the weight that all people hold as a shared human experience. And also the juxtaposition of man and nature. I think that's an interesting one. And we're going to talk about the material in a minute. So the specific choice to use stones to depict this image. And the ways in which the characters or the people in the image are positioned, how they have a similar structure and holding objects that contort their necks. So you can really see the physical burden of carrying these stones. And again, someone mentions weight. Someone mentions that the moon is associated with guidance. Absolutely, I think that's a really interesting reading of this presence of what we can assume to be the moon, but it could also be the sun. So the sense of like a guiding light or someone overseeing their progress. And also, someone also mentions the collective experience. So there's a really interesting sense in this picture of people working together. They're a group of people, they're oppressed by this weight, but they're all walking in the same direction. And there's a sense that they might be supporting each other and helping each other out. And in terms of the human experience, there's a lot of interesting ideas coming through as well. So the struggles are internally made by and of us. The idea of an endless torture, an endless ordeal. You could think, for example, about the myth of Sisyphus, if you're familiar with that, where someone has to push up a rock again and again up the, excuse me, up a rock face, and then it rolls down again. So the sense of like a pointless exercise as well, or a sense of the loss of hope. It could easily be related to the refugee experience, absolutely. Collective burden and hardship as a naturally human experience, but also the sense that each individual is different, I think is interesting, because that's something that the image really focuses on, the sense of each person is wearing different clothes, they look different, so they're not just one mass of people, but we can make out individual people in this picture. And I'm just going to have a quick look at some of the other ones, specific burdens, and they come in different shapes and sizes, absolutely. A shared experience of struggling and how we deal with tough situations, which is part of our journey. I also like this idea of a journey, which clearly this image conveys. This idea of life being routine and something that keeps occurring again and again and carrying the burden of life. Endurance and support is coming through again. Everyone making their own journey. So I think this idea of the journey is really prominent. Someone also links it to the experience of slavery. I think that's an interesting one as well, where you could think about some of the images you might be familiar from depicting people as part of the transatlantic slave trade and people carrying physical and emotional baggage. So I'm just going to change to my slides to just look at the image in a bit more detail, so we can discuss some of the ideas that you mentioned in more detail and think about what this unseen text might be telling us. And you've done a great job in terms of unpacking the key ideas that we find in this image and really linking them to a wider context. So as you already mentioned, it's a visual image. You can also describe it as an artwork, as many of you did, drawing attention to this being a picture of maybe a sculpture or something that is quite material as well. And the materiality of this image is something that I want to talk about in a bit more detail over the next few slides. So this next one, in terms of some typical features, you've provided a much more extensive list. Some of the ones that I picked out, which are also pertinent to this specific example, are the use of color. So you already mentioned the difference between the background, the gray dark tones, and then the moon. And then, of course, the colors that we see in the individual characters here. So the sense of an individual experience, they're different people. They're not just a unified mass of people there where you can't distinguish individuals. Composition is something that we already talked about. So the sense of people being different sizes, their baggages being different shapes, and the sense of really drawing attention to this moon as the central feature, which you could read, as you've done, as a sign of hope, as a guiding metaphor. But I think it also really emphasizes the contrast between this idea that there might be hope and then the people that we see that are quite oppressed by their burden. So I think you could think about how the experience of the moment is represented maybe in contrast to hopefully a brighter future, which the moon might be indicative of. And I think, as you already draw attention to as well, so the sense of a lot of the characters are, their necks are hanging low. You can see that they're really struggling under the burden that they have to carry, but there's still a sense of support and they're working together as a group at this point in time. Two other things I wanted to mention, and some of you already addressed this in your post on Padlet as well, is the sense of the material that is used. So as we discussed, this is an image of an artwork, and this artwork uses stones. So it's really interesting to think about the stone as a symbol. So the stone can be seen as a burden, something that you have to carry. You can also think about the stone as being a toy, something that you throw into the water or that you build something with. But as you can see here, it's also the symbol of weight, something quite heavy, something that someone has to carry. But then on the other hand, you might like to think about the stone as something that is connecting people to the place that they live. So something that comes from the land and it creates a connection between people and the place that they're living in or the place that they're coming from. So I think this is a really interesting idea that the author plays with in this image. So the sense of the different functions that the stone can fulfill and the different associations that we have with this idea of stones. And I think especially here as a stone as constructing something that looks like, my apologies, something that looks human, even though it's made out of nature, and it's often quite different from something living because a stone is seen as something cold at times. And someone mentioned in the Q&A session whether we could consider the single use of just stones to be universal. For one perspective, stones are all around us and constantly changing, just like people. Absolutely, I think that's a really important point to make. So I think the stone is certainly something that we can draw on to think about, something universal, something that most people can relate to because they have seen a stone in their environment, and something that is also quite physical. So something everyone can imagine or has touched a stone. So there's also this quite physical experience of seeing this picture made out of stone. You can almost feel the smooth surface. So I think it's a really interesting idea to use by the author in terms of creating connection with people across the world, but as we'll see a bit later on, also to create a specific connection with the context that they're working with. And I also wanted to emphasize the idea of framing. So it's really important to think about how the author puts a frame around this image. So one thing that you might like to think about, and you can't really see this here, you would probably see this better in an exam situation, is this frame part of the artwork, or is this a frame that the author put around the image? But in any case, the thing I wanted to draw attention to here is the sense of like the frame gives you an indication again of a specific link with a specific place and a specific culture. It might remind you of weaving or maybe a tapestry, something that is preserved, and it also contains this image. So it's important to also talk about the frame and how it might contribute to our overall understanding of this picture as something that's quite specific to a context. Of course, with unseen images, it's hard because you might not have the context, but you might make some guesses around what kind of pattern this is, what it conveys, or what it does in terms of the overall composition of the picture. The human experience we talked quite a bit about in your, you already talked quite a bit about this in your Padlets. And I think all the things you mentioned are really interesting links to make with the picture here. So you've talked about the experience of carrying a burden. Someone mentioned refugees, this idea of moving, of going from one place to another, of maybe having to leave the place that you live in to go somewhere else, this idea of the journey. So I think there's a lot of interesting links that you could make with possibly your own experience, but also with wider events that are going on. For example, this year, the link that you could make is with the conflict or the war in Ukraine, so the refugees and the displacement this has resulted in. And of course, you could tie it to other experiences of refugees or journeys that you might be familiar with or that you have discussed. And then finally, the link with other texts, there's a few coming through on Padlet, and I'll let you peruse those in your own time. So sometimes in the exam, you do get asked to bring in a text that you haven't seen as part of the exam, or just any example that you are familiar with. So it's good just to think about some texts that you know that discuss the big questions that are on the news this year. The link I've been thinking, and it's not a very current example, was Sean Tan's graphic novel, The Arrival, which uses just images but no text. So it's a graphic narrative without any textual indications. And it similarly emphasizes this idea of carrying a burden, of taking a suitcase with you, and really emphasizes the idea of if you're a refugee or a migrant, you don't just take your physical belongings in a suitcase, but you also take your memories and your personality to the material objects that you have left, and then you need to recreate a new identity when you arrive in a new country. So I'm not going to talk too much about this because this is very specific to each person, but it's a good idea to maybe have a few texts that tell you something about universal human experiences that you can draw on, and maybe think about one or two examples that you would mention. So if you can include a specific quote, that's great, but just more generally referencing a text that discusses a big theme or universal theme is quite helpful to show that you have thought about your text in a wider context. So then you've done all the groundwork in terms of thinking about what your text is doing. And I just wanted to briefly talk you through what you would be doing in an exam situation or when writing an assignment. So the first part we've already done. So we thought about important passages in the text. It's a good idea to write some notes or thoughts in the margin to really get down to the connections that you're thinking about straight away, and to also get an overview of what the big ideas are that you've thought about while reading the text. And then it's a good idea to really distill the main ideas that you've come up with. So to think about where you could be taking your answer, and also to really see which main ideas that you came up with are relevant to the question that you're being asked to answer. Once you've done that, it's a good idea to reread the text and think about which one are the most relevant examples that relate to the answer that you want to give, and that also really related to the question. So this is really important, to just include relevant examples that answer the question that you've been given. Once you're ready to write your answer, I've put a few things here on the slide. There's going to be more on the handout that Felicia prepared in terms of detailed information. But it's always good to quote directly from the text or to refer specifically to the visual features used, like you just did on Padlet. I think that was great, really thinking about a specific feature and what it's doing in relation to the wider example. And then really engage with it in depth. So don't use a quote to summarize the text or to give the reader information that they already have, but really think about what is this specific example doing. For example, just saying, oh, there's a presence of a moon in this picture doesn't really add much. So you can think about the moon as a symbol for hope, the moon as a symbol for light. You can think about the moon and its prominent place in the composition and what it does in terms of the answer that you're trying to give. So similar with other textual examples, it's really important to draw attention to something interesting, something that's noteworthy, something that's unusual, and that really relates to the question that you're trying to answer to your written response. And I thought I would include this here because it's relevant for exam situations, but any kind of assignment, it's good to think about time management. So for your reading time, it's good to read through the unseen text as the time suggests, but also already do a mental close reading. So do what we just did on Padlet, but do it in your mind and really think about what the main ideas are, the main ideas that you want to talk about and the main things you want to mention in your answer. Then it's a really good idea to do what we did at the start of the session. So read the question and unpack what it's asking you to do and think about the questions that are mentioned on slide 10. So this idea of what kind of text is it? What are some typical features? So already try to run in your mind to all that preparatory work. So once you can start writing, you know, okay, this is unusual about the text, or this is something I really want to focus on. Once your writing time starts, it's good to go back to important passages, write notes about them, highlight them, and really engage with them in depth. Make some notes, and then think about the structure for your answer. So if you have time to draft a structure, that's a really good idea because it will help you develop your ideas logically. And then the other good thing, again, if you have time to proofread your answer is really good, just to see whether there's any mistakes that you didn't see the first time around or whether there's anything that doesn't quite make sense. And as Felicia mentioned on the handout, it's a really good idea to practice this at home. So to time yourself and see how much you can get done in the allocated time, and then maybe think about, is there anything that you could be doing quicker or anything that you're wasting time on that you could change for the exam situation. So I'm just going to pause here for a minute in case there's any questions now before we move to contextual readings, but there will be another really long Q&A session at the end. I just thought if there's anything that comes to mind straight away or that relates to something that I said now, feel free to put it in the Q&A now. But as I said, you can, while I speak, just pop in questions and I'll have a glance, and if they're directly relevant, I'll answer them as I speak. Okay, so I'll move on, but as I said, if any questions come up, feel free to pop them in the Q&A part. And then I wanted to briefly focus on contextual reading as well, because it's something that is very important for exams and assignments, but also as you move along, if you're thinking of doing a university degree, this is something that together with close reading is one of the key things you need to do in your English assignments as well. So for you right now, why context is important is because it's key to English standard, extension, and advanced modules. It's specifically mentioned as something that students need to do and need to engage with in order to get a good mark. So as part of your exam, you will be asked to examine and are critically engaged. This depends on the module that you're doing, with the context of a text, and think about how this shapes the meaning. So how does context add to understanding of a specific text? So you will also need to think about how and why text influence and position readers and viewers. And this is related to context as well. So shaping your understanding of a text and how is this related to your background or your specific experience at this point in time. And more generally, by engaging with context, this strengthens your own interpretation, but also your personal perspective, and really shows a marker that you have thought about the text, not just in isolation, but that you can relate the text to a wider context and wider events that are going on in the world at this specific point, but also at the time of writing of the text. Excuse me. So you might be asking, what is context? And I think that's one of the first things that we just need to clarify. So context is generally defined as information that helps readers better understand a text and its meaning. But context breaks down into many different aspects, and I've included a few on the slides here, and we're going to talk a bit more about this in a minute. So it's thinking about the relative context of a text. So these include the historical context at the time that the text was written, the cultural context, the social context, but also the biographical or personal context of the author. So as you can see, there's different contexts that are different historical events that you can draw on, aspects you can think about for your reading. But the important one, again, is just to include the ones that are relevant. So it's not really important if the author decided to travel to Melbourne while they were writing their book, and it doesn't really directly affect the text or your answer in relation to the text. There's no point mentioning it because it doesn't really show that you've understood the context as relevant to the production of the text. The other thing to bear in mind is the text reception, and again, the associated context, which might be different. So the time of writing, the time of publication, and the time of reading when you are reading the text. So it's good to think about how the text was received at the time it was published. And it's also good to think about how it's received now, especially if there's quite a bit of a gap between the time it was first published and the time that you're reading the text now. And some good questions to think about and write notes on, especially for your scene texts, which you might encounter in your exam. So it's good to kind of write down a few ideas, and so you got a sense of what you might be talking about in your answer. The first one is, what was happening on a historical, political, and cultural level at the time when the text is set? So this is the first thing, at the time when the text is set, which might differ from the time it was published or written, and how this might have influenced the creation of the text. So you might like to think about the major discussions of the time. What was happening on a political level? Who were the major parties? Were there any elections? Were there any big issues? What were people discussing? Any kind of wars or conflicts that were going on? And was the author themselves involved in any movements or group? For example, were they an advocate for women's rights? Were they into animal rights? What was going on in the background that might have shaped the writing of the text? The other thing to think about is whether there were any significant events in the author's personal life that shaped the writing of the text. Again, as I said before, this one is really important in terms of picking out only events that are relevant. For example, if the question asks you to think about the author's relationship with women's rights, there's no point mentioning another movement that they might have been involved in, or another event that happened that's not directly relevant to women's rights. So it's really important to think about, what does the question ask you to focus on? The other thing to think about, as I started discussing on the previous slide, is what was happening on a historical, political, and cultural level at the time that the text was published, and how might this have shaped its early readers. Again, you can return to the questions that I put for the first question. So what were the major discussions of the time, any wars or conflicts, but also thinking about, were there any obstacles to publishing the text? Was it easy to find a publisher? Was it well received? What else were people reading at the time? What were kind of the typical books that they were reading? For example, if you're looking at a science fiction text, were those texts well received at the time? Was this something that a lot of people read, or was it more of like a niche genre? And this then also feeds into thinking about the techniques that I mentioned earlier. So audience and tone, anything that's creative or unusual, can often be traced back to a work maybe being not aimed at a mainstream audience. And then the final point is, what is happening at the time that you're reading and responding to the text? Are there any similar events or circumstances, or anything that is different? This year, one of the obvious examples would be an election. Was an election going on at the time that your text was published? As I said before, what are the big debates that preoccupy people in 2022? You might like to think, even though I know we're all fed up with thinking about it, the pandemic and its aftermath, climate change. What are the really big ideas that everyone is talking about and everyone is concerned about? So these are really good events to think about and to research a bit and get a sense of what you would write about this event and how this might have affected you personally and how this has affected your reading experience. Once you've thought about all these different ideas, again, a bit similar to what we're discussing in relation to close reading, how you're going to use context to inform the written response. As already mentioned, it's important to be relevant, so to just include the context that directly relates to your response. If we return to the previous example where the question was how the author uses language, forms, and features to talk about being creative, there's no point talking about a context that shows, for example, that they're really passionate about roses and other flowers. Unless you can link this to a specific example of creativity and how it shows us something about them being creative, there's no point including it in your answer. And related to that is the second point, so be specific. If you include context and mention it, make sure that you explain why you have used it. Why are you talking about this specific context? What does it add to understanding of this text, our reading of the text, and our thinking about how a text positions a reader? And then there's a question where someone asked if they should put all the focus on how context adds to the understanding of text, only if the question explicitly asks about it. My apologies. So it's really good to think about how many words you have left in a question and think about what is the main thing that the question asks you to do. So for the example with being creative, it was how, and it was a focus on language, forms, and features. So it focused the majority of the answer on that. With the to what extent question, you might get something about to what extent was the author shaped by their surroundings or by their context. If it specifically asks about context, the majority of your answer should focus on that. I would probably look at a few previous examples and see how you balance that. So in all, my apologies, in all exams, there's usually an emphasis on context, but it depends on which part of the exam you're looking at. So I would look at the specific examples that apply to the module that you're doing, and then make a note of which exams asks you to focus on context and which asks you to do something else. And I'm just going to look, yeah, that was the question I just answered. And I think this just brings me to a brief context for the example that we studied. So I'll just let you read this in your own time so that we have some time for questions, if there's any more. But I'm just going to briefly mention that the image is taken from a children's book that Felicia alerted me to, which is a really interesting one by Margaret Rose, which is called Stepping Stones, A Refugee Family's Journey. So by having this information, you do know that the image is about refugees, as some of you rightly guessed, but you can still make links beyond that specific focus. And I just put on the slides why Rose, so the author who wrote the story, was so fascinated with this stone and the use of stones. So she came across an image by chance, and she was interested in how something as cold and as unassuming as a stone could convey such strong emotions. You can see the picture that inspired her, which was a woman carrying her child while a man is carrying their suitcases or the things that they're taking to a new life. And I also just wanted to show you what the book itself looks like. And this is just to draw your attention to the kind of comparisons that you could be doing if you're asked to compare a text and a visual image. So here you can think about, we already talked quite a bit about the use of the different materials and different symbolism in the image. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. But some of the things you could be talking about here when you focus on the text is the use of language. So we have the English at the top, and then underneath you have Arabic. If you don't recognize the language being used, you can also just mention that it's a language that is not English, just to draw attention to the fact that you have identified this. And then you can really think about how the text and the image work together. So if you look at the image in isolation, you can think about refugees. You can see the quite harrowing images of people being in the water, presumably because they have died. But there's also a sense on the other side, if you look at the text, of hope. So the sense of hope that's mentioned in the text. So you can think about how the image and the text work together here to really create a sense of the experience of the refugee journey. And this just brings me to a brief mention of the handout. So this is the handout that Felicia has put together. So I'm going to share that in the chat in a minute, and I think Mac is also going to send it out to the people who attended afterwards. So while I put it in the chat, feel free to add any questions to the Q&A part, and we can answer them later. And just to mention that the handout has a lot of more detailed information in terms of what I was talking about today, and also has a very great list that Felicia put together of further resources and tips and tricks in terms of how to prepare for your HSC exams in English, especially in terms of training close and critical reading. Okay, so I'll just look for the handout, and in the meantime, feel free to use the chat to put any further questions in there. Sorry, not the chat, the Q&A. And feel free to send further questions about the handout to Felicia, and also any questions about the session today to me. So my email is on the first slide, and I'll just quickly share my slides as well while we wait, as this might be useful for people to have. Yeah, so there's a question about applying context for unseen texts. Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky one. So I would use any cues that you're given, and you can draw on that for unseen texts. I think what you just did with the unseen text worked really well. So where you talked about some of the context that is obvious from the image. There'll also be a sense, because it's an unseen text, of course, you won't know the context. So I think it's really important, if you infer any context, to base it on close literary analysis or close analysis of visual features, as you did on the Padlet. So I think that was a really great example where I could see, I assume most of you hadn't seen the image before, and you're able to deduct things that were contextually correct, but also just make other links. So it's really just about showing that you're able to think about a text beyond the text itself, and bringing ideas that are more widely related, and depending on the module, maybe also related to the human experience. Felicia, I'm not sure if you had any further advice as someone who's experienced at this level of teaching.
Lovely to meet you all virtually. Hi there. Yeah, I think with the unseen text, the section that I always have in mind is that common module that you have in advanced and standard English papers, and there you get a variety of unseen texts and also questions. So I think, again, as Dr. Hesse said, it depends on the sort of question that you're given. A lot of them do focus on how and focus on techniques, but there are ones that ask, how does this text depict human experience? And, in that sense, you could talk about techniques, but you could also talk about any contextual elements that could be relevant. So I think it really comes down to the question.
Thank you. And there's another question coming through. So is it better to make an attempt to see the context, even if it's completely wrong? My answer would be yes, unless the image clearly indicates that it's a wrong context. For example, I was thinking with the example we looked at was like, you couldn't talk about climate change, but you could talk about climate refugees. So I think as long as you can show that the context you're inferring is related specifically to an aspect of the image, and you make a good case for it, I would say there's no wrong context, because you're not given that information. But do pay attention to any information that you're given. So if you know the name of the author or where the text was published, any kind of information that is there, you need to make sure that that doesn't contradict the context that you're inferring. Any other questions? So as you might have seen on the handout, there's a really great list of resources that Felicia put together, including the one I really wanted to highlight is the previous exam and markers feedback. So I think this is a really useful resource. I'm not sure if you have come across that already in your lessons or to your teachers, but the sense of like, what are markers looking for? And they also have some model answers. So you can really get a sense of like, what would be a good answer, but also more generally, what did markers draw attention to in terms of the things that students did well, but also the things that students could improve. So that's a really good resource to look at. So that's on the handout that I shared in the chat, and it's direct linked to the website that allows you to have a read of what the markers thought and what they thought could be improved. So someone asked if they can assume that you can just go to the point without a mini intro, a mini conclusion for unseen questions. I can see Felicia laughing. You want to answer that one?
Again, with that one, it depends on the mark allocation. So the ones towards, I'm thinking again about that common module, the ones towards the end that have a larger mark allocation, like the 5-mark ones or the 8-mark ones, you might want to put a 1-sentence little mini intro, but often for those comprehension style questions, you just got to get straight to the point, because you've only got a limited amount of time, and you've got 3 different things to do in that time period, 3 different sections of that paper. So yeah, yeah, you wouldn't do it for a 1-mark question, but you might do something very like, for a 5 or 8-mark question, you probably could just do a 1-line sort of little intro.
Great, thank you. Someone says tips for psychoanalysis. That's an area I'm not very familiar with. I'm not sure if, yeah, I think it's always, yeah, I would use that very cautiously. And someone said, do you have any suggestions on where to find unseen text use as a practice? Excuse me. I think there was a list of ideas on the handout, if I remember correctly, where you might find some unseen text. But I think just anything that you find, you could think about, I don't know, a news article, an image that you see. I'm not sure if your teacher might have some recommendations where to find specific examples for the modules that you're doing. But I think anything could be an unseen text. I'm sure you're already doing this, but looking at past exams, it's really useful to get a sense of the unseen texts that were included, and just try doing some of those. And then the good thing is that you can then look at the marker feedback or model answers and get a sense of what worked, and you might be able to deduct to what extent your answer ticked those boxes.
Another thing that I sometimes do with some of my students is you can sort of work in groups and you can sort of create your own sort of, unseen texts and questions and sort of swap them around. So you sort of can work in the reverse fashion, which is also quite helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sharing resources with friends and classmates is a really good idea. As you can see, the text we took was an example from a children's book. So anything that you find lying around, a random book you find in the library, you could turn to a page and just have a read of that page and see what you would take out of it. So, and again, I think the library, it's one of the places that Felicia mentions on a handout as well. It is also a really good place because they often subscribe to magazines, so Time magazine, and you can just even the cover page of Time magazine, what does that tell us? What is that image doing? And again, that helps you to relate it to current events as well, because often the cover page has something that is really preoccupying everyone and something that will be relevant beyond that specific close reading. So someone asked if you would ever be marked down for an incorrect interpretation of the text. Oh, that's a tough one. I guess it's subjective, but I think that's the marking criteria. So again, I would recommend looking at those. And I think the thing to be careful about, and what I've been saying throughout this presentation, is that you need to respond to the question. So I don't think there's an incorrect interpretation of a text, but I think there's a question or an answer that misses the point of the question. So this is where you need to be careful. For example, if it's a how question and you respond to a compare question, or it's to what extent, and you do something else. So I think that's where it's not an incorrect interpretation, but it's an interpretation that doesn't fit the question. So I think that's where I would recommend being careful. Was that the final question or the one that's just come through?
Or maybe just one last one, maybe.
Yeah, so just how would you combine context and analysis of the text in a response? That's a good question. I don't think there's one size fits all model. But again, just return to this, and sorry that I keep going on about this, but I think this is one of the things that students often struggle with. It depends on the question. So really think about what is the major focus of the question. Is it analysis or context? Focus on what it asks you to do, and then bring in the other thing as it's relevant. So if the question is about how does this author bring in context to make a wider point about the major issues of the time, again, your primary evidence would come from the close reading, but you might spend a bit more time talking about one major issue that they're addressing, so one major context. But if it's a how question, so to return to how do you use language, forms, and features in order to show something about being creative, you wouldn't need to bring in a lot of context. Maybe you wouldn't even need to bring in any context if the author doesn't have any specific context about being creative. So again, read the question closely and think about what is the main thing that the question asks you to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hesse, and Felicia as well for this fantastic webinar. And I can see that in the Q&A, Claire just said, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and advice today. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. And I think it's, thank you again for Dr. Hesse for the expertise from the university point of view with the research and expertise, but also Felicia, I believe we couldn't have delivered this with this solid content with the teaching background. So thank you so much, Felicia. I'm just going to share a quick, I just want to share that if you found today's webinar helpful, we are running a few more different topics of webinars this year, starting from Articulate Economics that's coming up in a few weeks' time. And in term 3, we also have Chinese in context and French continue as an extension. And don't forget to save the date for the University of Sydney Open Day on Saturday, the 27th of August. And finally, we do have social media content. If you're year 12, I think you'll be enjoying your holiday by then, but if you're in year 11 or if you're a teacher teaching year 9 or 10, it's a good content for the maybe well-being aspect. So we do hope to see you there. For more information, you can go to our Articulate website and you can take the photo on that QR code. And once you close this webinar, it does take you to a quick evaluation. We would like to keep improving and find out whether you found it resourceful and helpful. So please do fill out the evaluation survey. And thank you very much for coming. And thank you once again to Dr. Hesse and Felicia for joining us today.
And thanks to everyone for being so participatory and for your interactivity. It was great to get so much feedback on the Padlet. So thank you very much and good luck with your exams.